when Adam and Eve broke relationship with God in the garden, what happened? Well, obviously, when they sinned, it separated them from God. But very quickly, in the biblical record, it separated them from each other. Right? It broke their relationship. They started to blame each other. And then very quickly after that, it divided the relationship of their children. Right? It wasn't too long until one killed the other. Broken relationships. Let me ask you, what's hard about your job? What's hard about your work? Let me rephrase it. What's the hardest thing about your work? And my guess is it's not your work. It's the people you work with. What's almost always the hardest thing are relationships that make work even more work. You know, some people in life have internal struggles, right? Their issues are kind of encapsulated into themselves. But that's a rarity. For most people, the struggle in life is relationships. Can you imagine what your life would be like if every relationship you had, family, friends, work, wherever, was perfect? What would your life be like? My guess is there'd be a whole lot of things you just wouldn't care about anymore. And your stress level would probably drop, and you might even sleep at night. I think we could go so far as to say is the biblical history, right? What the Bible unfolds is the dysfunction of relationships of people with God and people with each other. That's what it is, right? The relationship with God gets broken, and now relationships with people get broken, and this whole thing unfolds like an awful carpet unrolling of broken relationships, and it goes on and on and on. I want to look with you at two scenes from the life of Jacob. One of them today, and then one of them 2 weeks from now. In between, we're going to be talking about gratitude and some of the things that happen in these chapters. But these two scenes, how God restores relationships. The first one and the second one. And I'll remind you, Jacob finds himself at this point in life where he has a broken relationship with at least two people. With his brother Esau, we're going to look at that one in 2 weeks, and with his father-in-law Laban. That's Jacob's life. Matter of fact, he ran from one of them. He ran from the one from Esau, and we're going to see in a few moments what does he do? He runs from the one with Laban. Now, before we read this text, let me just codify what I've said so far. Sin, selfishness, godlessness are behind and underneath every broken relationship. I got to tell you, I don't find a relationship anywhere that's broken that sin, selfishness, and godlessness isn't behind it and underneath it. It's just what happens. And we wonder sometimes why relationships are so hard. Well, it will accompany godlessness, selfishness, and sin. Now let's read the text, chapter 31, verse 22. It says, on the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. You remember Jacob took his wife, his kids, and all this stuff, and he ran, took off. Verse 23. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. And then God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream at night, and he said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now let's observe at this point that this relationship with Laban, its brokenness, it took 20 years until Jacob fled. Right? Jacob put up with stuff for 20 years. He took it up with the deception, with all the changes, and he'll discuss that more in a few moments. But 20 years. This relationship got off on the wrong foot almost from the beginning. and it began to erode. These 20 years, time makes unhealthy relationships unhealthier. Right? They don't just get better. If you're waiting around for an unhealthy relationship to get better over time, no, it doesn't work. The history of the Bible said, no, it doesn't work. Right? Look at the Middle East today. Has time made those broken relationships any better? Hardly. Right? Russia and Ukraine are exactly having a party today. Time does not make these things better. They often get worse. Like two trees that get planted in their position and their roots get buried, and after 20 years, they are immovable. They're not going in each other's direction. They are becoming more and more entrenched in their positions. And finally, after 20 years, Jacob says, that's enough. I can't take it anymore. I'm out of here. Broken relationships usually end with somebody running, right? Somebody fleeing, somebody quitting, or a crisis confrontation that leads to it. In this instance, Jacob runs before the confrontation. The confrontation is going to follow. But in other instances, it's the confrontation and then the fleeing. But they always end that way. Somebody leaves, somebody backs out, somebody says, I'm done, no more. Jacob, after 20 years, has enough. And what does Laban do? He goes to confront him. Now, let's not miss the text where it says he takes his relatives with him. Right? Laban is not going so he can have a discussion with Jacob. Right? He's taking his army. He's going after this guy, and he's going after him to catch. He doesn't just want to powwow. Right? He's bringing backup. Okay, so Jacob is going into this not with the intent to resolve it. Oh, he wants to have a confrontation, but this is not a peacekeeping mission. So let's read what happens next, verse 25. Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him. And Laban and his relatives camped there too. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done? You've deceived me. You've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of tambourines and harps? Okay, remember, this guy is a deceiver. He is a liar. This idea, what is it? Oh, hey, we could have had a party. He does not mean that at all. Verse 28, you didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. That's always helpful when you're resolving a conflict, right? When you tell somebody, hey, I can squish you like a bug. I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your fathers said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you've gone off because you long to return to your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? You remember the background? Rachel, his daughter, took his household gods. Verse 31, Jacob answered Laban, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. I was afraid. That's the same thing Adam and Eve said to God in the garden. I was afraid. Right? It's the same sins behind all of this. Verse 32, but if you find anyone who has your gods, he shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there's anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it. And Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So, Laban comes to confront. Do you know that apart from God, confrontation is about blame and pain and power and fear and self-justification? Right? That's what happens. Laban's going after this. Why? Blame. Laban says, Jacob, you did this. And Jacob responds, well, I was afraid of you. Right? It's about power. Who has control? Jacob's afraid. And in this instance, both of them are justifying their actions. I'm here because of you. And Jacob says, well, I'm here because of you. And it just doesn't go very well. No effort at this point by either one of them to resolve. No, they're going to correct each other. They're going to punish each other with words. Just as a side note, when you go into any kind of confrontation with the mindset that you're going to straighten somebody out, you're not. It's not going to work. That is not godly confrontation. That's not the way it works. It's supposed to go. Most of the time, it's us who need straightened out. Right? So Laban, he is all hot and bothered, and he gets his relatives, his army, his force ready, and he's going to go, and he's going to confront this guy, and he's going to straighten him out. And what he finds out is that he needs to learn a few things. Jacob needs to hear a few things and see a few things in his own fear as well. When confrontation is about blaming the other person, right? When it's about telling them how much pain they've caused you and holding power over them and justifying yourself, it is not going to go anywhere. So what happens next? Verse 33. So Laban, he goes into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maidservants, but he finds nothing, right? Because he's all bothered. He's got to get his household gods back. That seems to be more important to him than anything else. Verse 34. Now Rachel had taken the household gods. She put them inside her camel's saddle, and she was sitting on them. And Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. And Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched, but could not find the household gods. I wonder where she learned to lie and deceive. Her dad taught her well, and her husband did pretty good too. Verse 36. Jacob was angry, and he took Laban to task. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? Now that you've searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I've been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I didn't bring you any animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself. And you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or by night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. This is going really well. Verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine or about the children they have borne? Come, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." In all of this brokenness, in all of the blame, all of the self-justification, God has to be heard. Right? If relationships are going to be restored, God has to be heard. Everybody knows what everybody else is thinking. Laban knows Jacob, Jacob knows Laban. They know the details. They've lived through all the experience. And nothing changes until somebody hears God. We go back to verse 24 when Laban takes his crew with him and he goes after Jacob. Verse 24 says God appears to him. You be careful what you say to Jacob. Don't say anything good or bad. Don't go after him in any negative way, and don't make any false promises. God knows exactly who Laban is. He knows how he uses words, and he tells him you be careful with your words. God shows up and speaks to Laban. God reveals himself to Laban. And Laban acknowledges it again in verse 29. And it gets acknowledged again by Jacob in verse 42. All right? So in the brokenness of our relationship, let's remember that God can speak. God can speak, in this instance, to our enemy. Right? What Jacob doesn't get until this happens is that God can speak to Laban. He's got household gods. He's used divination before this. But God spoke to him. God revealed himself to Laban. That is the astounding thread that runs through this passage. And it is God who speaks. And where are the other gods, by the way? Where are they? Where's Laban's gods? Right? They're silent. They're hidden away. They cannot reveal themselves. They cannot overcome deceit. Laban's gods are in a bag in a camel's saddle under his daughter. And they are impotent. Don't miss that. They're impotent. But God can get through to a guy who doesn't even care about him in a dream and cause him to recognize himself, cause him to see things the way they are. Somewhere in our broken relationships, we have to hear God. We have to hear what he has to say, right? In our fear, in our blame, in our self-justification, God has to get through, and we have to listen to him. And you will notice in verses 38 through 42 that truth matters. Right? When God is going to restore relationships, truth matters. Jacob is full of fear and resentment. He doesn't want anything to do with this guy anymore. He wants to get away and he wants to leave. And Laban has been deceitful. Right? And so they both know and they both hear that. Let's not miss that God was there for all 20 years. Where's God in these broken relationships? Where's God when my relationships are falling apart? Where is he? He was there. Laban knows God was a witness. And Jacob knows, if God hadn't been with me, where would I be? So we have to hear God. We have to know that even in the worst of relationships, it's not like God is checked out. Somebody else might check out on us. We might check out on them. But God is there. He's the witness. He sees and he knows. And he wants to bring truth to bear on the situation. Right? We're going to see truth. We're also going to see grace. The same things that happen with Jacob and Esau, we'll see that in a couple weeks. And it's no coincidence that the law comes through Moses, but what comes through Jesus Christ, God's Son? Grace and truth. Truth matters. God is there, and the truth gets acknowledged by both of them. Laban acknowledges that God spoke to him and said, Laban, you better be careful. You're going there to set this guy straight, and you want to take power over him, but don't you do what you want to do. Don't do what's in your heart. And the truth comes out, and Jacob is no longer talking about fear and blame. He says, this is how it's been for me, and if it wasn't for God, I wouldn't have made it. And then Laban says, he looks. Some of the saddest verses in the Bible. Verse 43, he looks and he says, I've lost all this. It's mine. Right? These families aren't supposed to be divided and broken, but they are. They're not relatives, right? They're talking about each other's relatives. Nothing about family. And Laban comes to the conclusion, I can't do anything about this right now except make it right with this man. He says, let's make a covenant, you and I. You see, the truth matters. And when we hear God and we see the truth and we acknowledge what God has said, and it takes two people. Both of these guys are acknowledging this. It won't work if Laban just acknowledges it, and it won't work if just Jacob acknowledges it. Both people need. So when a relationship that's broken needs restored, it's not just you getting it right, the other person has to get it right. Not just you hearing God, the other person has to hear God and has to acknowledge the truth and has to submit to it. Has to come under and say, yeah, that's right. Do you notice that Laban never says to Jacob, those are lies. That's not the way it went down. Laban submits to the truth. Jacob says, this is how it was. And God was there. If it hadn't been for God, I'd be in big trouble. And Laban, yep, that's right. That's exactly right. And look at all that I have lost. I need to make this right. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be submitted to. And that is very, very hard to do. When I have to submit to the truth of God about me, about my behavior, about my attitude, about my words, that's the battle, isn't it? Right? Me submitting to the truth of God, acknowledging that I'm not who I should be. Acknowledging with the Scriptures that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and I'm one of them, and it is my sin. It is my selfishness that's behind and underneath this broken relationship. That's hard to do. Oh, we see it very clearly in other people. Right? Jacob can tell Laban everything about himself, and Laban can tell Jacob everything about himself. But not until they both see the truth of God for each of them. Here's what else has to happen. Somebody has to propose peace. Somebody has to hear what God is saying. Somebody has to submit to it. And somebody has to say, I want to make this right. There are two astounding things in this text that we've read. One is that God reveals himself to Laban. And the second is Laban says, let's make this right. Come. Let's you and I make a covenant. Unbelievable. Laban is the guy that moves forward. What happens? Let's read verse 45. So, Jacob takes a stone and he sets it up as a pillar. He agreed. He's going to move Laban's way. He said to his relatives, gather some stones. They took stones, they piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Right? They sat down and ate together. In the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, eating together is the resolution of relationship. It says we're good. You and I are good. We sat down and we shared a meal. Our relationship is good from here forward. Verse 48, Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. That's why it's called Gilead. It was also called Mizpah because he said, may the Lord keep watch between you and me when we're away from each other. And of course, Laban can't stop being Laban. Verse 50, if you mistreat my daughters, if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember God's a witness between you and me. And wisely, Jacob said nothing. Right? There's time to be silent, and Jacob had it. Verse 51, Laban said to Jacob, here's this heap, and here's this pillar I've set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness. I won't go past this heap to your side to harm you, and you won't go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father judge between us. And so Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. Now they're no longer Laban's relatives, they're his. And after they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and he blessed them. And he left, and he returned home. Laban did not kiss Jacob. And if you're expecting a kiss after this kind of broken relationship, take what you can get. Enjoy the meal, and move on. What happens between these two after 20 years? When God is heard and the truth of God is submitted to, one of them finds the nerve to say, we need to make this right. I need to humble myself, and I need to propose peace. And I need to propose letting the past go. I need to forgive, and we both need to move on. That takes guts. Because you know why? Because what can happen is you get rejected. What if the person says no? And so we're afraid to do it. And we're afraid to put ourselves out there. And you're never going to have a healthy relationship without vulnerability. It just isn't going to happen, right? You're never going to get married unless you say, hey, how about we get married, and you risk this person saying no. It might be a good idea to do a little homework ahead of time before you pop the question. But this is part of relationships. Vulnerability. What if I get rejected? And it's amazing that the guy who's at the forefront of this is the guy that God revealed himself to. He's willing to acknowledge the truth. He had other gods that he was worried about looking for. It'd have been different if Jacob talked about God, but it is Laban, and he proposes peace. And there's forgiveness, and there's boundaries that are set. I mean, I could go on and on about relationships from this text, right? Healthy relationships have healthy boundaries. Healthy marriage has healthy boundaries, just the way it is. There are things that are out of place. And Laban and Jacob, they get that, and the Bible gets that. But they forgive and they let go. This is the first restoration of a broken relationship in the life of Jacob, right? After 20 years, things are set between he and his father-in-law. Finally, 20 years. Sometimes it takes that long, but God is there, right? If you're thinking, well, it's been a year. It can't be restored. It's been 2 years, can't be restored. Well, you don't know that. You don't know when people start listening to God and when people start submitting to the truth. It doesn't matter how many years it's been. Right? It doesn't matter. God can bring a restoration there. The truth is, God can bring healing to our relationships. We're not very good at it. Let's just be honest. We're not very good at it. We're good at breaking them. We're good at pain and power and selfishness and blame. We're good at saying, no, God, I don't want to go your way. We're really good at that. But bringing them back together, not so good. But God is. God is. God changes hearts. Not just minds, but hearts. God gives a new heart. God can give brokenness. Right? But it's going to come when we hear Him. When we hear what He has to say. And when we submit to that truth. And all of a sudden, the blame stops. All of a sudden, the agenda changes. And the past is not as important. I love the fact that these two don't sit down anymore and talk about what happened. What happened gets buried. Oh, it's going to go on in their memory. And I'm sure, Laban's or Jacob's probably not going to send him a Father's Day card. But it's done, right? And there comes a time when things in relationships that were wrong, they just need to be buried. They need to be forgiven, and they need to be let go. Never to be resurrected. Never to be the subject of conversation. I believe 1 Corinthians 13 in the love chapter says, love keeps no record of wrongs. Right? They get deleted from the hard drive. They don't get brought back up. And they eat, and they agree upon the boundaries, and they go on, and it's settled. So the question becomes, that's great for Jacob, all right? There's great truth about relationships, okay? Good. The question now is, what is God saying to you and me? What is God saying to you about the relationships of your life? What is God saying to you about your own heart and your own attitude, right? Can God get through to you? Can God bring His Word into your life and into your heart? Whether you're right or whether you're wrong. And the truth is, in most relationships, there's a mixture. You're not all wrong and you're not all right. There's this mixture. And can God's Word land in your heart? And will you acknowledge it? Right? And will you turn this over to Him? Laban's going to straighten out Jacob. And what he finds out is God was coming to him to straighten out him. And God was going to show Jacob what Jacob needed to see. They don't need to straighten each other out. Right? They need to hear God. And God can do that work. And He doesn't need my help, and He doesn't need your help. Right? He can do that work. Even if your enemy is hot on your heels, He can do that work. So what is God saying to you today? God can bring healing in our broken relationships. He can. I can't promise you He will, because it depends on more than you. It depends on the other person hearing God. But all you can do is listen to God. All you can do is submit to his truth and leave the other person in the hands of God and let him speak and let them submit. But if there's a crack in the door, if there's an opening, maybe you need to be vulnerable and say, how about a covenant? How about we make peace? How about we get this behind us? Yeah. God can bring healing. Let's pray.